Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Reverend Angela Denker. Angela is an ELCA Lutheran pastor and veteran journalist. Her first book, Red State Christians, was the 2019 Silver Forward Indies Award winner for political and social sciences. It was also just a phenomenal book, by the way. She is a columnist for the Minnesota Star Tribune and has written for many publications, including Sports Illustrated, The Washington Post, Fortune magazine, and has appeared on CNN, BBC, Sky News, and NPR to share her research on politics and Christian nationalism in the U.S. Pastor Angela lives with her husband Ben and two sons in Minneapolis, where she is a sought-after speaker on Christian nationalism, its theological and cultural roots. She also serves Lake Nokomis Lutheran Church in Minneapolis as pastor of visitation and public theology. Angela's new book is titled Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. You can learn about all of Angela's work on Christian. There it is.
There it
Love it. You can learn about all of Angela's work on Christian nationalism, American culture, social issues, journalism, and parenting on her Substack, which is called I'm Listening, and on our website, angeladenker.com. So Angela, welcome back. It's so wonderful as always to see you again, and congratulations on all of your great work.
Thanks, Brian. You've been in this space for a long time of trying to lift up people's voices, of trying to, give voice to this alternate form of Christianity that's not steeped in Christian nationalism. So I'm grateful for the networks that you've provided and just your steadfastness in continuing to provide this space. So glad to see you again.
Well, thank you. I mean, thank goodness for you, and the people that are standing up and speaking truth to power and saying what needs to be said because it's uh, in such dire need these days.
Yeah, I used to keep it posted on my computer desk that said, this is true of both journalists and I think pastors too, but it said, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So
Mm,
that's
there
a
you
good
go.
mission for our time.
That is so true. So, before we get into your book, is there anything else you'd like people to know about you?
Oh gosh. No, I don't think so. I'm just, Disciples of White Jesus is an interesting corollary to Red State Christians. And what I've been thinking about a lot lately as we're in the midst of Trump's second term is that this, even if you look at these two titles, it really helps to sort of encapsulate and explain the transition that American Christianity and Trumpism has undergone from Trump's first term to his second term. So my first book, Red State Christians, really talked about how Trump capitalized on this sense of quote unquote patriotic Christianity that really idolized America itself, centered in a form of sort of worship of God and country, sort of a soft Christian nationalism in a sense. We've now moved into this new phase of disciples of white Jesus, and there's less of an overt idolatry of the nation and really more of an idolatry of Trump himself and of other leading individuals within this group that exemplify this hierarchical gendered masculinity. So the transition is really interesting to look at, and certainly COVID played into that. The assassination attempts played into that, and Trump's sort of messianic complex. But those two titles, I just think, are interesting signposts of our times.
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So true. So let's go back to Red State Christians, for a moment. That was kind of a watershed event type of book, I felt, and I'm sure it had to impact you that way.
Yeah, another sign of the times when Broadleaf, which was then Fortress Press, first approached me about doing this book. I had wanted to write a book specifically on Orange County, Southern California Christianity. The reason that they wanted me to do Red State Christians instead was because this was right in the wake of J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy.
Mm.
And there was this sort of interest in national media in covering Trumpism and Trump voters. And so the publisher at that time really sort of pitched Red State Christians to me as almost a Christian religious version of Hillbilly
Mm.
Elegy. Uh,
Wow.
which is fascinating now that we've seen sort of the transformation of J.D. Vance from sort of liberal media darling to, hardcore traditionalist Catholic, hater of cat ladies, Trump's leading VP. Again, it speaks to our current moment and how much everything has changed.
Hmm. So let's shift books and talk about the new one. As I mentioned, the title is Disciples of White Jesus, the Radicalization of American Boyhood. How did that book come about?
I'll put it up here again because I
Yes.
love what they did with the cover. I got to have some impact on that, and it has sort of a journalistic Americana feel, but also sort of a haunting sense. And somebody told me when they looked at the font choice, they said it was evocative of Nazi Germany, which wasn't necessarily intentional,
Wow.
but
Wow. And it's unusual to have such a dark color for
yeah,
the main background.
yeah,
So many books, I think best practices and attention are bright
yeah,
colors.
yeah. Yeah, I love it because it's almost like a newsprint feel,
Yeah,
of that
yeah.
dark gray. So anyway,
Well, the Red
but yeah,
House really stands out, and that's kind
yeah,
of, evocative of the theme of the book, right? So,
yes. And again, like going back to Red State Christians, in the beginning of that book, I talk about the song Pink Houses from
um,
John Cougar Mellencamp and,
oh gosh.
you know, uh, Ain't That America? So yeah, interesting transitions. Tell me again where I got lost on the cover here.
Yeah,
Where
no. So, how did this new book come about?
Yeah, so this was not the book I intended to write next. I was hoping to veer away from right-wing politics and write something a little bit more easier to digest, I think. And so I was exploring a few different ideas and looking at a little bit more of sort of my own story, looking at how success has been redefined in America and sort of what it looks like to reject conventional commercial success in
Hmm.
favor of a gospel of theology of the cross. Um, but broadleaf again sort of had this idea, they're connected with the Lutheran Church. They're here in Minneapolis, which is where I am. So we kind of have an ongoing communication, and they
Mhm.
had come to me with an idea about a book on boys and men, but really sort of a narrowly conceived idea of a very, very short book, maybe more like a pamphlet, geared specifically towards congregations.
Hmm.
And, the idea was I would put this out really quickly and it would really be geared towards churches. And I wasn't all that interested in that because when I started to think about this topic, I was sharing it with other people outside the church. And what I became aware very quickly that this is a topic area looking at white boys and men and what's happening demographically for them, both from a parenting, educational perspective, and also looking at the role of violent masculinity within the church and how that's impacting this
Hmm.
group. Um, Very quickly, I became aware that people are interested in this book who are never going to set foot in a church, specifically a Lutheran church. And so I felt like this is such a big topic area. It needs to be a big, book for general readers, enough time and resources to do a lot of research. And so I kind of came back to them with an expanded idea for, this book I initially didn't think I wanted to do, and then now I'm all in for it. And really one of the moments that I became sold on doing this book too was I met Caleb Campbell, whose story makes up one of the final chapters of the book, almost as a reversal of the first story of the book. And Caleb was telling me about his own journey, that he had gone from sort of a conventional conservative Texas and Arizona Christian childhood to joining a white supremacist skinhead group to then going from that group to becoming a disciple of Mark Driscoll out at Mars Hill and getting into evangelical masculinity rhetoric, becomes an evangelical pastor. And ultimately where Caleb ended up after COVID, watching the fallout of COVID, he became a real resistor of Christian nationalism and suffered for it with people leaving his church, suffered physical health consequences, but has really been galvanized in this idea of being a missionary to Christian nationalists based
Mm.
on
Mm.
both his own personal story and his theological and faith convictions. And I saw in that story a really powerful lens of what a reformed evangelical masculinity might look like, and some hopeful paths out. And just the authenticity with which Caleb shared that story with me, it really inspired me again that these were stories that I was willing to dive into. Maybe he gave me some hope. So,
Mm. Wow. Wow. Crazy times, right?
yeah.
Um, so in the book's description, it says white boys and men are dangerous. White boys and men are struggling. Both of these statements are staggeringly true in America today. So can you say more about that?
Yeah, it's tough, right? As you mentioned, I'm the mom of two boys, two white boys. I'm married to a white man. And, I don't want to think of them either as quote unquote a problem or dangerous or that they're struggling. And yet at the same time, every time, that I would tell people that I was writing about white boys and men, just so many personal stories pour out from people about their grandson, a student in their class, a player on their team, their sons, their friends' sons. This sense of lost identity, this sense of floundering, and then this sense of into that sense of lost identity or floundering comes pouring this online radicalization principally, these antiquated religious ideas that are paired with new age supplements, muscles, manosphere, tech bros, podcasts, um, that cause a construction of identity that's really rooted in a masculinity that's violent, that's angry, that has trouble forming relationships. And the two statistics that really frame those two statements that I think are important accompaniments to understanding and looking at what I'm addressing in the book is that white boys and men are both more likely than any other demographic group to be mass shooters, and they're also most likely to die by suicide.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we have this dual sense of violence externally and violence internally. And the problem of both sides can't be solved without acknowledging the other part.
Hmm. Well, the phenomenon that you're talking about there had a huge impact on this last election, right? I mean, it was kind of surprising, at least, to a lot of observers that the young, white male or young people more generally, you know, um, backed Trump at a higher degree than what I think anyone expected.
Yeah, the unfortunately, this last presidential election has made my book even more relevant. And
Yeah,
the
yeah.
things that I wrote about, you could see play out in that election. Uh, one one sense of that you really notice, and that I think the reason why it caught so many people by surprise is that there was almost this deification and sort of admiring of Gen Z by national media and sort of this painting with really broad strokes about a generation and, how tolerant they are, and there was at the same time almost a patronizing view of who they were. And there wasn't enough sort of listening to this whole generation. There wasn't enough examining of their media habits, of the kind of media that they were consuming. Um, and so what it led to is, on one hand, you had a Democratic campaign that was sort of pandering in its solicitation of younger voters. And then you had a Republican campaign that was feeding into the worst, but also the most prominent tendencies of online media that was being consumed principally by young men. But there was just so much ignoring of some of these warning signs around what was happening with Gen
Mm.
Z. When you look at influencer media, particularly, just the rise in the trad wife movement, the rise
Yeah.
in these mom influencer accounts that were really supporting traditional gender roles and supporting a gender hierarchy, encouraging women not to go to work, encouraging people to homeschool. all of this, intensified by a pandemic, all of this intensified by a belief in conspiracy theories, a lack of trust in institutions and media. Um, and so when you examine all the factors, it's not all that surprising, but it was surprising because of the lack of depth and willingness to really listen and understand what was going on with this younger generation.
And I think, speaking for myself and other people I talk to too, it's like we've had this hope of the
Mhm.
younger generation, realizing how screwed up my generation is, that, you know, that they'd see through the problems and help us turn it around. And like, as you and I were talking beforehand, it's going to be a long road, I'm afraid.
Well, and I think that there's Melissa Dickman, who leads PRI polling. She's done a recent book on Gen
Mhm.
Z women, and there is, reason to look towards the tolerance and liberalism of particularly Gen Z women and some of those trends. So it's not that this is an overwhelmingly conservative generation. But I do think what people need to take away from the election and from the research that I did is just how big a role that nihilism and cynicism are playing in the American populace at large right now, and certainly among younger generations. And a generation that is untrusting, a populace that is exhausted and overwhelmed and beset by rising costs for home ownership, rising costs for rent, rising grocery store costs, all of those things leading to a sense of nihilism and cynicism that feeds into authoritarianism, that
Mm.
leaves people looking for a leader who promises to save them and also looking for people to blame
Mm.
for their
Mhm.
situations.
Yeah, yeah. So there was another comment in the book's description that caught my eye too. It says it is especially focused on the role of right-wing Christianity in the increase of religious-based hatred and violence. And so, how were you able to penetrate that world in order to learn so much about it, particularly in light of your earlier book?
Yeah, I think this is so much like the air that we breathe as Americans, and that's something that I've wanted to, a common thread from both books. I begin Disciples of White Jesus following the story of Dylan Roof, who was a white supremacist mass shooter, committed one of the most horrific acts of violence in recent years in a killing of 9 people at Mother Emanuel, historically Black congregation and leader in the Black church. Uh, the thing about beginning with that story that was important to me is that as I investigated his own religious background, he comes from an ELCA congregation, from a mainline congregation that's the same denomination in which I'm ordained. Um, and so there's a there's a certain facile sort of superficial examination of racist hatred that happens a lot of times in America, and we think we can identify really quickly the spaces in which it happens and thereby absolve ourselves.
Mm,
Um, and so part of what's really important is just realizing that there are no certain spaces where this occurs that are unique from the rest of America. This is
mm,
increasingly and especially a problem in affluent, progressive neighborhoods
mm,
that young men and boys, to the chagrin of their liberal parents, are becoming increasingly radicalized into right-wing um, mm, forms of gender hierarchy. And I think too, some of that is a result of a vacuum of content in liberal progressive spaces, even in public schools sometimes, about masculinity. There's
mm.
just, and I am sympathetic to this as a feminist, there's this sense of, okay, white men and boys have had their turn. We've got to talk about other stuff. But because there just hasn't been kind of any positive content, then when young boys and men go looking for, well, what does it mean to be a man? The only thing they encounter is right-wing radicalized content.
Yeah, that's a really good but unfortunate point. Hmm. So, because of of your work, and because you've been out there, sharing it, you have to be the target of a lot of trolling, and worse, I'm sure. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons that, this second book launch has felt much more trepidatious. And, it's harder to feel excited or feel, proud. There's really this sense of guardedness that I have going into it. Because I'm very aware of the anger and frustration that this kind of conversation can engender. I'm very aware that like a lot of people just don't want to talk about it. A lot of people don't want to engage, like la la la. Um, so that's hard. I'm pretty numb to the kind of trolling or hate that I get online. I kind of have exited Twitter or X. It's really just become a complete cesspool at this point.
Yeah,
And there's not a
yeah.
lot of helpful information on there. I am on Blue Sky. I think that that's, vetted a little bit better as far as just a place for less radicalization, less inflammatory content. And I just really try to lean into the real present relationships, whether it's being outside, whether it's being in my congregation, doing my visitation with elderly church members. That kind of stuff is really grounding and kind of keeps the other stuff at bay.
I hope you also feel support from the other people who are also in your camp, so to speak, that are speaking
Yeah.
out and writing important things and forming, quote unquote, the resistance or whatever we want to call it these days. I, I hope that's the case.
Yeah, there's definitely a piece of that. Some people like Kristen Dumais, who wrote Jesus and John Wayne, Beth Allison Barr, who has her own new book coming out, but writes a lot on biblical womanhood. uh, Sarah Stancor, I think I guess particularly I'm naming women. There's men too. Brad Onishi is a great partner
Yeah.
in this work. But I think there's also that caution that, a lot of folks who have big platforms in a progressive Christian space have had their own issues with narcissism or have had their own issues with misconduct. And so there really is sometimes there can be a sense of guardedness for me when I just look at, well, who really wants to be supportive and who is sort of out, you know, in a more competitive type spirit.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, so, I think you know this about me. I was initially an engineer and then a business person. So my
Like,
inclination is always to look for the what do we do about it
right.
kinds of, solution to the problem, so to speak. But in your
Right.
conclusion of the book, you say, if you have read this book hoping to be handed a simple prescription, you are going to end up disappointed. Now, I understand that this is not simple by any stretch of the imagination, but can you say more about that, I'll say, conclusion?
Yeah. No, I love your story. My husband is an engineer and, we say that he's always asking how and I'm always asking why. And so we make a good team. Um, but I think my caution there is not that I don't want to look for solutions because I think they are there within the book, but my caution is more of this sense of it seems like a progressive prescription to societal problems has often been based from a national level and sort of in the sense that, well, we can address it from a legislative proposal. And so if we have legislative policies, if we have national prescriptions, I mean, you saw this downfall in the presidential election, again, of a lack of a local ground game and too much of a on high controlled prescription. So I think that's part of what I'm reacting against when it comes to what's happening with men and boys. And the other caution too is I think that if I were to lay out sort of these big policy level prescriptions, it leaves individual people feeling kind of disempowered. It's like, well, I can call my representative and that's it. Or maybe I can vote. So what I wanted to do really is empower people that one of the important ways that we enact societal change and why I still kind of believe in the local church is that it does begin with relationships and it also begins with alternative narratives for the young men and boys in our own lives. What are some of the alternative narratives? And I think you yourself, you have an alternative narrative of what masculinity can look like and what in a very male-dominated background, in a traditionally masculine background, but how you've used it to lift up many marginalized voices or stories that may have gone, not as well unheard. So I just think that being able to help boys and men see themselves in alternative narratives and examples in their own lives
Hmm.
is really, really helpful and important.
Hmm. Yeah. Yep. Amen. So what would you like the readers to most take away from the book?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I just said is really important of just like, okay, if you're feeling overwhelmed, because I think we're all feeling overwhelmed right now, just take a step back and look at your own life, your own web of relationships, and who are the young men and boys and old men and boys in your life that you want to have an impact on, that you want to discuss what masculinity looks like for them. Really look at your own relationships, your own community. And again, that's why I always really want to make it clear that the problems of society that we see are not problems of somewhere else in America, that these trends exist everywhere. And so wherever you are when you're reading this book, um, there's places in your own community where you can make a positive difference, that you can begin to build relationships. And oftentimes, that can look like local organizations. They don't have to be faith-based, but
Mhm.
local community-based organizations are some of the strongest weapons we have against fascism and authoritarianism. Local bonds, building trust, all of those things are really important right now.
Yes, yes. Well, I really need to take that to heart and think more about what I can do personally in that regard. Um, so in your acknowledgement sections of the book, you talk a bit about working with Broadleaf Books, who personally I have come to admire more year after year. What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, so as I said, I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor. I've been ordained over 10 years. And also Broadleaf is headquartered here in Minneapolis, where I live. So it's that unique experience of, my agent is in New York City and she's kind of got her pulse on, the literary and journalistic world is very much still headquartered in New York City. But what's great for me with Broadleaf is, it's just down the road. If I want to see my editor, I can see her in person easily. I can connect with our PR person in person. And I think there is, that willingness to engage too on a theological level. I do think that Lutheran theology, when it comes to understanding Christian nationalism through the lens of the theology of glory versus theology of the cross, is really important. And for me too, as someone of German American, German Lutheran descent, the complicity of German Christians in the rise of Nazism, I think, calls me to a sense of responsibility of not being one to just go along with what's happening in
Mm-hmm.
American Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the Broadleaf folks see it that way too?
I don't want to speak for them, but they support that I do, I will say, which
Yeah,
is I'll
yeah,
take that.
yeah. So another really wonderful thing you did in the acknowledgement section is a shout out to other authors working kind of in a similar space. And I love that, first of all, and I don't necessarily see enough of it, from
Yeah.
authors because I don't know if there's a competitiveness, implied, but compared to the other industries I used to work with, the competitiveness level and the motivation to be competitive within this space is so much different, right? I mean, I think that collaboration among similar authors is so much more valuable than treating each other as competitors. How do you view all of that?
Yeah, I'm always kind of surprised by it because if I meet someone who I think is better than me, like, doing a better job with covering a certain topic or writing well or having a more successful book, I see that as like, oh, I really want to meet that person and I want to learn from them and grow from them. But I think there can be a sense of jealousy or insecurity. And again, I think that is too bad. And it does
Yeah.
to the hold that theology of glory has. Because, the publishing world is getting smaller all the time. There's less and less money available. There's less and less ability to get things done. It's more and more based on celebrity. It's more and more based on, what's the most inflammatory thing we can get out there. Um, so those relationships of support are so, so key and
Yeah.
important to helping, to spread the work too. And so, like I said, there are those relationships that just continue to be invaluable in these kind of spaces. And I hope to continue to build more of them. I'm
Good.
interested.
Good. I think I totally agree with everything you just said. So a lot of our audience are authors not necessarily as far along as you are. So what kind of advice do you have for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's advice that I need to take myself, right? Like, you say like, oh, they're not as far along as you, and I think, oh gosh, I'm not very far along. And I think what can happen in this journalism media space right now too is that as you achieve things, you keep kind of moving the target so that you never feel like, oh, that was something that went well. And so I do
Mm,
think it's important for people to look back and, as we're sitting here in front of me, I do have like a cork board with some things that inspire me on there. And, a couple of them are feedback from people. One of them is a note I got from my grandpa before he died. He was a pastor and he went through his own experiences of rejection or, faith crisis. And so I do think it's important to hold on to, those positive things because there's such this tendency to, you can get all kinds of positive, supportive comments, but if someone says one negative thing, that's the thing you remember. And
yeah,
that's
yeah.
really just a way to, get you to stop speaking the truth. So,
Well, I hope you know how much support you have and how much good work you've done. I mean, Angela, I just can't emphasize that enough. So please don't forget about all the wonderful things that people say about your work.
well, and thank you for making this space. And you are someone who's working to connect people. And I think that that's just really, really valuable. And I wish there were more people like you. So,
Well, there's little that I can do these days, but anyway. So I know you're right in the middle of a important book launch, but I have to ask you if there's other things, kind of on the horizon, whether it's books or other projects that you're able to talk about.
yeah. Well, one thing that is just nothing, nothing official is starting with it, but I am thinking about writing a novel next.
Wow.
So I'm kind of leaning into this idea that, at a time of rising authoritarianism to totalitarianism, we really need novels that speak to what's going on, and that are going to bring a different readership than maybe Disciples of White Jesus will. So I'm thinking about that. I have some ideas.
So the
Maybe,
next 1984?
maybe. Sure, reading. I'm always going back to 1984 lately. Ignorance is strength is some corollaries to fake news. So, but I'm constantly on Substack. I hope people come visit me over there. I'm posting there all the time. It's a really lovely community. So
Good.
grateful for that in this ever-shifting journalism world. Um, and then I write columns occasionally, a couple times a month for our Minneapolis paper, the Star Tribune. So, grateful to have that space as well.
Good, good. Well, Angela, again, congratulations on your new book. I really hope it does well, and thank you so much for all of your work. Again, the title of Angela's new book is Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. You can learn more at angeladenker.com. Angela, thank you again so much, and many blessings.
Thanks, Brian.